But then we have the coming of the English, right? The English are coming to Roanoke Island, and they are exploring the river systems of northeastern North Carolina and of eastern North Carolina, and they're making contact with the native peoples that are in that region. Next slide. So we know from John White's drawings that, and from the writings about early exploration of eastern North Carolina, well documented, the coastal areas. This is a map of eastern North Carolina. It shows clearly the Outer Banks. It shows Roanoke Island. It shows the Albemarle Sound. It shows the Roanoke River and the Chelan River. You have to turn it sideways. If you turn this map sideways, then it looks just like eastern North Carolina, right? And if you look at the map closely, you'll see that eastern North Carolina is called Virginia.
But there was blacks, there was natives, and there was Europeans.
Carolina intermixed and intermarried with one another. Then we see in the swamps, particularly the Great Dismal Swamp, but also the Alligator Swamp, we have maroon societies. These Africans that are dropped off in eastern North Carolina, they make alliances and intermarry with Indian people, Indian women who are in eastern North Carolina in places like Hyde County. And they end up being independent people and still seeing themselves as native people. And they exist and live throughout eastern North Carolina and in the swamps of eastern North Carolina. Then you have frontier settlements. In the 1600s, Virginia, originally when Virginia was founded, there were indentured servants. There were Indian, black, and white indentured servants. There was no real distinction being made between any of these groups of people. When you finished your servitude after 5 to 7 years, you could basically be free. And you could go and, after your servitude, purchase land and begin to grow tobacco and, try to make a life for yourself, just like the other white planters. Eventually, Virginia began to change the law, and they evolved into what we call race-based slavery. And they began to legislate that whites and blacks could not marry, that whites, blacks, and Indians could not, marry and own property in Virginia, even though there were many peoples who had already intermixed.
Come on, guys, let's talk about it. I did a stream a week ago where I exposed the hidden history behind the fact that Mildred Loving of the historical case Loving versus Virginia, she was not an African American woman at all. She was a full-blooded indigenous woman in Virginia, the same place where they reclassified Native Americans as Negro. Yeah. Yeah, they got everybody thinking Loving versus Virginia was about an African American marrying a white person. No, this was about an indigenous person marrying a European. That's what this was about. Virginia, y'all, they've been doing some shit in Virginia.
So we had already triracial and biracial people who were Indian and black, white and black, Indian, white and black, and they were basically forced out of Virginia because they would have had to become slaves because they began to move to race-based slavery. And if you had any African ancestry, you were going to be considered a slave. Many of these people will move to the frontier. So when we talk about the frontier settlements and we talk about mixed people on the frontier settlements, some of the first people to settle the frontier and really negotiate and trade with other independent Indian nations on the frontier, like the Tuscarora, were mixed race people, because they found it easier and better to live with native people than to live in the white settlements where the whites were trying to force them into slavery and servitude. And then finally, native nations, and then we talked about the Meharans, we talked about the Nottaways, we talked about the Tuscarora, as well as the Bear River and the Machapungas and the Mattamuskeet. Most of these independent Indian nations, they adopted runaway slaves, Africans, as well as poor whites who were indentured servants who did run away as well. And so they adopted these people into their nations, and they
Come on, y'all. Them natives was devastated. Them natives was killed off. They were warred. They were destroyed. So they just started adopting anybody, y'all. They started adopting anybody. You white? Okay. You African? Okay.
married with their nations. And as I mentioned to you before, the Tuscarora claimed responsibility for destroying the lost colony and taking the white settlers that were there. And they routinely they and their kinsmen, the Six Nations, harbored runaway slaves and intermarried and intermixed with them. So many native nations in the eastern U.S. on the frontier or border with white settlements had mixed race people and were mixed race. Not all of the Indians in the nation were, but a number of them, a significant number of them were of mixed race, because at that time, native people did not, and still I think for the majority today, it wasn't about race, it's about, kinship, and most of them were matriarchal. If your mother was Native American, if your mother was a Tuscarora, then the child is a Tuscarora, whether the father was white, whether the father was black, whether the father was Cherokee. If the mother is a Tuscarora, the child is a Tuscarora. And most of the nations in the eastern United States, that was how they developed their communities and their societies. So they were based on the bloodline of the mother. And they basically, the children followed the bloodline of their mother. So in that sense, you could have a native woman who might have a child who was dark skinned, who looked like an African, or have a child that was light skinned with blonde hair and blue eyes and looked like a white person, but the mother was Indian. So we see a lot of that happening with many of the native peoples in eastern North Carolina during this period.
Okay, Dr. Smallwood, I know we have at least one question. So at this point, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
All right. This is Akeem from Elizabeth City State University. How transformative do you believe including this information into formal education will be, or could it be?
Well,
That's an excellent question, because again, this man is a professor at a college in North Carolina. He specifically teaches history majors. Unless you're going to college in that area for a history degree, you're not really going to be privy to this knowledge. Or you can be an autodidact like myself and just always be thirsting for new knowledge. But yeah, guys, I think this should definitely be in formal education. I wonder why they teach us so many seemingly useless things during grade school, but they don't teach us about this, do they?
a person who believes that education matters, and the better educated people are, the better decisions that they make. And I would say, coming from Eastern North Carolina and sharing a heritage that, is what I'm trying to, teach people, I think that for everyone, understanding this history and understanding how we are all connected is beneficial. And I certainly would like to think that many of the people who reside in that region in Eastern North Carolina, understanding like their food ways, their cultural ways, the things that we do in Eastern North Carolina, how heavily influenced they are by our native ancestors and by the native people. Even the foods that we eat, corn, beans, and squash, with the Tuscarora and Iroquois called the Three Sisters, those things did not exist in Europe prior to contact with Europeans and Africans. They were introduced to Europeans and Africans by the Native Americans. So there's just so much, that I think we can all learn from understanding how interconnected our lives are and were during this particular era, and how, of course, over time, people forget and they move apart or move away, but how much we had in common.
We have another question. And this is from Dr. Chris O'Riordan Aja from Wake Tech Engineering. Great presentation and information. Is it possible to get these PowerPoints things? And I can answer that too. Yes, they're going to be housed with the Michael Ure Show, and you can email me, Chris, and I'll send you all of the slides. And also you can get them directly from Dr. Smallwood.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? If not, I'm going to just announce. Normally, we try to keep this. Oh, another one from Elizabeth City. Thank you for answering my question. My alma mater, ECSU, is in Pasquotank County. Great presentation. Thank you, Akeem. And Akeem used to teach a class at Wake Tech as well. So that's how I met him. And we took some students on the trip down there before the pandemic. And we're going to take some students to A&T when the pandemic is over, otherwise virtual. And I know a lot of you have to leave at 12:30, but we're going to continue, and we're going to do this just like we're in class. And we will go all the way up until 5 minutes to 1. So now, Dr. Smallwood, you can continue.
Okay. All right. So next slide, please. So this is just illustrating some of what I was talking about. So we've talked about Eastern North Carolina. We've talked about exploration. We've talked about the English making efforts to try to plant a colony at Roanoke. We all know that that colony failed. Many of you didn't know about the fact that there were Africans left there as well. But what this map illustrates is as Virginia, and then of course when the English come back in 1607, they attempt to set up a settlement in Jamestown, which is successful. And from Jamestown, they begin to expand, north, west, and south back into North Carolina, where they had failed to really get a foothold for quite a few years earlier. This map illustrates after the passage of the laws to change, who could be considered a slave or who could be put into indentured servitude to Africans, and making Africans basically slaves for the rest of their natural lives. Many of these mixed race people, they were already biracial and triracial, Indian, black and white, flee Virginia and move down into Eastern North Carolina, particularly in Bertie County, where a lot of the earliest settlers of Bertie County were mixed race people who settled in Bertie County with the Tuscarora Indians. That region down there was controlled by the Tuscarora. There were Meharans to their north, as you see on this map, to the west. There were Meharans, and of course there were Nottaways in Virginia, just on the border with the settlements. So, and again, the Nottaways, the Meharans, and the Tuscaroras are all Iroquois. They're all in military alliance. Many of the native peoples to the east, the Powhatans, were being fractured and being enslaved by the English as they expanded in Virginia, and they were coming down into northeastern North Carolina, had already had a devastating impact on native people in eastern North Carolina. And many of these people were coming into military alliance with the Tuscaroras because of the fact that they were the strongest native group there on the border on the frontier with the English who were coming in. So this map illustrates the English campaigns in eastern North Carolina and the routes that they took to move into Pasquotank, Perquimans, Chowan, Coratuck counties, and then over into the Bertie precinct and what became Bertie County. So these settlements continue to grow. And as these maps are illustrating, as these settlements grow, you do have the Great Dismal Swamp, which can't be farmed and is very problematic for whites. And lots of Native Americans and Africans move into the Great Dismal Swamp and they intermarry. And there are also runaway white indentured servants or whites who just don't want to be under Virginia rule, who move into the Great Dismal Swamp as well. And then you see down in the southeast with the Alligator Swamp, it's the same thing. And you need to remember, so if you're studying early colonial documents, that the Virginians considered northeastern North Carolina to be Virginia. They called it Old Virginia. So eastern North Carolina, all this area that you see shaded in gray, all of this is considered Virginia. And so Virginia pretty much policed the area, but they continued to expand west and try to acquire, good tobacco land in the coastal plains and in the Piedmont, and they just didn't have the energy to try to track these maroon communities in the Great Dismal Swamp, which I've already explained were basically independent, sovereign, Indian, African mixed nations in the Great Dismal Swamp and the Alligator Swamp of eastern North Carolina. What they did is just went around it. They tried to avoid those people, but those people existed as independent sovereign people in those areas, and it became, somewhat problematic for them until they began to drain the swamps to try to get those people out. Next slide, please. So we see large numbers of white indentured servants. We see large numbers of English settlers beginning to move into the British colonies in the Caribbean, as well as in Virginia and North Carolina, and even in the Northeast and places like Massachusetts. Next slide, please. And because of the importance of tobacco and the expansion of tobacco plantations throughout Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, the need and the demand for labor became very intense, and they will begin the process of importing large numbers of Africans as well. And so we see, eventually tens, hundreds, thousands of Africans being brought into North Carolina and Virginia and into the 13 colonies, as well as the British Caribbean. Next slide, please. So we see the development of colonies, of English influence, the English colonies in Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, and even in New England with Massachusetts, as well as places like Rhode Island and Connecticut. But there were other European nations, the Dutch along the Hudson River Valley, the French along the St. Lawrence River Valley, and even the Swedes. So we have other Europeans who are attempting to settle. But in all of these areas, there are Africans being introduced as slaves in all of these areas. And these Africans are running away. And these native people are taking these Africans in, and they're intermixing and intermarrying with them. And they are opposed, in the Northeast, the Northeastern Indians stand opposed to slavery. Now, why this is the case, I'm not completely sure, but the Six Nations, the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Tuscaroras, along with the Meherans and Nottaways, who are their brothers and kinsmen, tended to stand against African and Indian slavery, and they tended to oppose the expansion of slavery into their territories. And you can see the locations of their territories on this map, and also the Indians that are aligned with them, which would include the Delaware Indians, the Nanacoke Indians, and even those members of the Powhatan Confederacy who have not already been enslaved or destroyed by the English in the Chesapeake River Valley or the Chesapeake Bay region. Next slide, please.
And Redskin says, I don't agree because, once again, why would natives, as they call them, not go anywhere on the land that is their own? They would know every inch of that land, swamp or otherwise. Well, you have to realize just because someone's a Native American doesn't mean that they have the knowledge of the whole entire East Coast. I mean, Native Americans had a certain area they stayed in, certain tribes over here, certain tribes over there. Maybe you even have a warring Native American faction you're beefing with on the other side of the river. So, you're not just freely roaming and moving and having intimate knowledge of every part of the land. It's kind of like me, for example. I'm born and raised Sacramento, California. So I know California, Northern California, parts of Oregon, Nevada, but I'm not going to know the South or the East Coast because me and my people never really ventured that far, right? So, yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
So again, we'll talk a little bit about the slave trade, the Native American slave trade, and the African slave trade, and I should be able to touch on the Tuscarora War. Next slide, please. Many people know about the African slave trade. Fewer people know about the Native American slave trade. There were millions of Native Americans, beginning with the Spanish in the Caribbean, who were shipped out of the British Caribbean. We talked about this in the last presentation, back to Spain and Portugal, and many of the women were sold as sex slaves and concubines to the various families in Europe. The same thing happened in North America. People tend to not understand that there was a brisk Native American slave trade, and that yes, other Native Americans assisted the English in enslaving Native Americans. And so we see that the Tuscaroras were caught up in this trade. Native people were not unlike Europeans or like African peoples. They had long-standing disagreements and conflicts with one another.
And shout out to American Black Holocaust Survivor. I think you came to the stream late. So we're specifically discussing the African slaves that intermixed with Native Americans. So that's why he's focusing so much on the African side of things. We're not at all discussing the Aboriginal Indigenous Niji of America. We're not, specifically discussing the Anasazi or the Negro Amerindians. We're touching on the African slaves that fled, revolted, warred against plantation owners, and then intermingled and intermarried with Native Americans.
The Catawbas, the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Yamasees, they did not get along with the Tuscaroras and their allies, the Six Nations or the other Indian groups that were aligned with them, like the Saponis and the Tutelos and the Choanoks. And so then when the English offered guns and gunpowder and munitions to Native Americans, if they would assist them in destroying Native nations or enslaving those nations, there were nations that did involve themselves in that slave trade. So like
divide and conquer, and maybe that's what led to the reclassification of melanated Native Americans as Negro and slave. Picture this. Picture a pale face Asiatic native get solicited by the Europeans. Hey, we'll give you some guns. You can take over those black indigenous folks. You can kill them. You know, you've been beefing with the blacks, right? So not only do they enter into a deal with the devil, i.e., the European, but they then go ahead and enslave those black natives. And now those black natives find themselves on plantations right alongside the white and African slaves.
Like Africans being involved in the African slave trade and then selling those Africans to Europeans. There were Indians who were involved in the native slave trade, and they used the weapons that the English gave them to defeat and destroy their enemies, and those Indians were sold off into slavery. One of the largest, biggest causes of the Tuscarora War was the kidnapping and enslavement of Tuscarora women and children, which was occurring by white settlers who were moving into eastern North Carolina and by other groups of people. This set off the Tuscarora War, which became the bloodiest and most destructive war in colonial North Carolina history. But there were tens of thousands of Indians, millions of Indians that were kidnapped and sold into slavery and shipped to the British Caribbean. While I have this illustration up, I will mention just very briefly. Generally speaking, the men and boys were sometimes shipped to places like Massachusetts and to New York and Philadelphia. But what they didn't realize is that the Tuscaroras in particular were allies with the Six Nations. So as soon as these Indian males got north, they ran away to the Six Nations. And as I said, the Six Nations never returned slaves. And in fact, it was almost inciting a major continental war with the enslavement of Tuscaroras. So they began to ship the Tuscarora men and boys over a certain age to the Caribbean, to Jamaica, St. Kitts, Nevis, and they would be seasoned there. They could not run away. They could not get back. They knew the landscape in North America better than the English did, so they couldn't escape and get back to their people, so they sent them to the Caribbean. They kept Native American women, and they...
Come on, y'all. They don't talk about that. They don't talk about that slave trade. They don't talk about the fact that they did enslave Native Americans, sent them on plantations, but goddamn it, they know the lay of the land. They know how to escape. They know how to dip. So what they started doing is taking the indigenous folks and shipping them as slaves to Jamaica, the Caribbean, South America, because at least they didn't know that land, so they wouldn't be able to run away so easily. So God damn it, there's some people in the Jamaican, the island of Jamaica, some people in Puerto Rico, some people all over the Caribbean who probably descend from indigenous Americans.
Shipped African men who had been seasoned in the British Caribbean to the mainland, and they intermarried them or bred African men with Native women. And of course, the Native men that were sent to the British Caribbean, they paired them with African women in the Caribbean. So there was a process, and this trade did exist. North Carolina was a part of the trade. One of the causes for the Tuscarora War, and even at the end of the Tuscarora War, over a third of the people are going to be slaughtered in the war. A third of the people are going to be enslaved and shipped to various plantations in Virginia, North Carolina, and the British Caribbean, and they're going to be made into slaves, and they're going to be mixed with African people. This is a forced mixing, biracial, triracial mixing, and we've talked about all the different ways in which Native people are mixed with Africans. Next slide, please. Again, just illustrating that slave trade and the European nations that were engaged in it. Next slide, please. And then again, getting to the question of how slavery affected both communities. That's both African communities and Native American communities. And as I've illustrated, again, as people are introduced and the need for labor and the legal expansion of slavery, both Native Americans as well as Africans are caught up in what we call the Native American slave trade, and they are being basically used as slave labor to clear land and to cultivate cash crops, particularly in North Carolina, tobacco. Okay. And again, and it has to be touched on, it does split Native American nations in between slaving nations and non-slaving nations. And we look at the divide today between the North and the South, and that divide basically Virginia, North Carolina. I talked about in the first part of this presentation, the northeastern woodlands and the southeastern woodlands. The northeastern woodlands pretty much runs down to the Cape Fear River, and it includes the Tuscaroras and the Algonquins that were on the coast, the Machapungas, Mattamuskeet, Bear River, etc. And it goes from there along the Cape Fear River northward. So the Indians south of the Cape Fear River, and its source is here in the Triad region, in the Winston-Salem, Greensboro region. Those native nations south of that river, they like the Catawbas, the Yamasees, the Cherokees, they became involved with slaving, with actually taking native peoples and selling them as slaves. And as a result of that, unfortunately, there became conflicts between the northeastern Indians, the Tuscaroras and their allies, and the southeastern Indians, which led to wars between the two groups of people. So slavery had a very negative impact on native people in North Carolina in terms of dividing native people, and they'd already had disagreements or conflicts before, but the slave trade really only intensified these differences between native nations that were present in North Carolina. Banned in the colony, and any free woman who marries a slave will serve the slave's master until her husband dies, and their children will be enslaved. So we see again that there were mixing that was taking place between whites and blacks, and whites, blacks, and Indians, and we see laws trying to deal with them. I always point out to my students that we don't pass a law until we have a problem, right? We didn't pass seatbelt law until people were being killed not wearing the seatbelt, so we made it mandatory. We didn't pass drunk driving laws. People can't drink and drive until people were starting to be killed, and we said we got to do something about it, so we passed the law. So when you look at this legislation, these laws that are being passed in Virginia, and they're impacting North Carolina because North Carolina is seen as a part of Virginia, you have to understand that this is something that's happening. How rampant it is, but it's happening, and it's problematic to the leaders of Virginia, and they wanted to change it. Next slide, please. And then the last of these laws that I think are very important is we go to 1664. Let's see, Mark's husband, we already did that one. So we go down to 1670, and we talk about Indians being captured elsewhere and sold as slaves to Virginia were to serve for life, and those captured in Virginia until the age of 30. The point is that you see that there is a very brisk Native American slave trade taking place in Virginia and in North Carolina in the 1600s. Next slide, please. Here, what we want to point to is, I'll go down to 1682, and it says all servants who were Negroes, Moors, mulattoes, or Indians were to be considered slaves at the time of their purchase if neither their parents nor country were Christian. Now, you heard me talk about Moors before, right? You heard me talk about Muslims before, right? We've been talking about African Americans and Indians, right? And so what is a Negro and what is a mulatto? Well, many of the early documents will show mulattoes as being Black and Indian. And so we assume mulattoes are people who are Black and white. But we'll see, if you look at the colonial records and you look at slavery, you'll see that Black and Indian are considered Negroes and they're considered mulattoes. And so we're basically classifying mixed people and pulling them away from their traditional way of interacting with one another to create a slave society so that you can have an enslaved labor force that will help to enrich the landowners and the plantation class. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to stop with these. I won't go into a whole lot more detail, but you see by 1691, owners were compensated for Negroes, mulattoes, or slaves that were killed resisting. And then in 1691, we also see a law being passed forbidding the miscegenation of that abominable mixture between Africans and whites, or Africans and Indians, and then any white man or woman who marries a Negro, mulatto, or Indian is to be banished. We talked about the people moving from Virginia to Eastern North Carolina.
Damn, say it ain't so. They was banishing us light skins. They was banishing us. Shame. We kicking you out the country. We kicking you out the land because you mixed. Abomination. All right, y'all. All right. Us light skinned folks, us multiracial, multicultural folks, we've been getting a bad rap from the beginning, huh?
To Bertie County, that they're going to be banished. So the point is, what I'm saying is that they're finding people, they're banishing people, but laws are being passed to try to separate these people, but they're mixing them all together and just calling them Negroes or calling them blacks, when in fact they are, of mixed heritage. And if they were in Indian communities or Indian societies, they would be considered Indian. Okay, so we'll pass through this. Next slide, please. And then again, these last ones I point out just because, again, talking about mulatto again, in 1705, it's important to remember that North Carolina doesn't legalize slavery until 1715, which is 2 years after the end of the Tuscarora War. And one of the reasons why they're doing this is because they have now captured all of these Indians, Tuscaroras, Mattamuskeet, Bear River, all these different Indians who had aligned themselves against them in the war, and they've made them slaves. And then we go up to 1705, and it says a mulatto is defined as the child of an Indian, the grandchild or great-grandchild of a Negro, right? So we know that Indians and blacks have intermixed and been intermixing for a very long time, probably as free people, most likely as free people in the swamps. And then they're being captured and they're being sold into slavery on plantations in Virginia and North Carolina. And so the law is adjusting to that, to deal with these Africans, these mulattoes and Indians, and they're going to be prohibited from holding office, prohibited from owning land, and laws are going to stop them from being intermarried with what is considered, pure whites or whites who are not of any mixed ancestry. Okay, next slide, please. And so now we're coming into the Tuscarora War, and we're going to wind down this presentation if I have time. So, Michael, you have to let me know. Mr. Ure, let me know when it closes out. But we'll wind it down real quick. As I mentioned, the Tuscarora War was as much about slavery and about the kidnapping and enslaving of Tuscarora women and children and the allies of the Tuscarora, the Algonquin peoples in Eastern North Carolina, as anything else. And that is what will set off that war. Next slide, please. And so we see the Tuscaroras sitting in Eastern North Carolina. I talked about the Cape Fear River being the dividing line between the Northeastern Indians and Southeastern Indians. And so not just the Tuscaroras, but their allies, the Hatteras, the Cape Fear Indians, that are in Eastern North Carolina. These Indians all tend to be opposed to the institution of slavery because so many of their women and children have been enslaved and mixed with Africans. And so they are going to engage in a great war, a great military campaign against the whites to end their expansion.
And shout out to ASAP. ASAP says, I still think you're an asshole, but thanks for educating us. Well, thank you for the Cash App. I appreciate the support. I'm glad you're learning something new.
Expansion and their colonization of their homeland, and to basically push them out. You see to the southeast, those Indians south of the Cape Fear River, the Catawbas, the Yamasee, the Cherokees, the Creek, the Chickasaws, Choctaws, what we eventually call the 5 civilized tribes. They were all actually slaving Indians. They all actually owned slaves and forced marched slaves out to Oklahoma when they moved to Oklahoma.
Come on, y'all, let's talk about it. There were slaves on the Trail of Tears as well. It's no coincidence that out of the thousands, there were literally thousands of indigenous tribes in North America. Out of the thousands of tribes, they call 5 of them civilized. And it's the 5 that have intermingled with Europeans, assimilated into European culture, and started holding slaves and running plantations. Of course, those are the 5 token Niji they want to cherry pick. Okay, all right, interesting. Interesting dynamic. Did you guys know when they talk about the civilized tribes, they basically mean sellouts that were in bed with the white men? Not all of them, but the leaders of the tribe at that time sold out the rest of the tribal members. Come on.
After Indian removal, but they are involved in the Native American slave trade and later in the capturing of runaway Africans throughout the 16 and 1700s. In fact, the Timucua Indians that you see down here in Florida and the Appalachians were completely decimated by the Cherokees and sold off into slavery to Charleston, South Carolina, and shipped to the British Caribbean. So slavery had a very negative impact, not just on North Carolina and Virginia, but on the
Yeah, Reskin says there's your mixed tribes right there. Yes, these are the tribes that have been getting mixed with, having foreigners get adopted in, bringing in Africans, bringing in Europeans. That tribe done been so washed out and diluted. The Spaniards was chopping them up. Then they brought the germs, was killing them off. I mean, I try to have some empathy for them. You know, we don't really know the extent of what they suffered, but God damn it, these were the tribes that were at the end of their ropes, and they just gave in and sold out and said, "Okay, you can march us all the way to fucking Oklahoma, to some desert land."
the Deep South as well, and we still see lingering and lasting effects of this institution on just not just African people but Native peoples as well. Next slide, please. So this map shows the villages, the Tuscarora villages in eastern North Carolina, just at the start of the Tuscarora War, and the roads leading into the to the southeast to where the southeastern Indians are. Next slide, please. And again, these are the Native Americans that were in alliance with one another's against the colony of North Carolina during the Tuscarora War. So there were Seneca Indians who had come down from the New York State. There were Iroquois Indians who were supportive, not just the Senecas, all of the Six Nations, but the Senecas, one of the largest groups. The Monacans, who Jefferson said were Tuscaroras, but they were a mix of, yes, Tuscarora and Siouan people, but the Monacans of the Piedmont of Virginia. Nottaways, who I've already said were, basically Iroquois and kinsmen or a branch of the Tuscaroras, the Meharans, and then Mingos, who tended to be a mix of Seneca and Tuscarora, who did not follow the matriarchal bloodline. They were a part of this alliance as well. And then to the east, you had your Machapunga Indians, your Bear River Indians, your Mattamuskeet Indians, the Core and Noosk Indians, all of whom were of mixed ancestry, African Indian white ancestry. And they create a confederation that will fight against the white settlers who are trying to expand into their territory and to enslave their people. Next slide, please. This is just an advertisement that was at a Boston post office, and it illustrates the selling of a Indian boy from Carolina. That's what's highlighted. Again, this is just documentation showing the enslavement of Indian people from the Carolinas, and that they were being shipped not just to the Northeast, but to the Caribbean. Next slide, please. And this is the Tuscarora War Council, with their whites there, John White, I'm sorry, John Lawson, John Lawson and Baron Christopher de Graffenried, who were held. You see in the center there, two white men with their hands bound, and the one African with his hands bound. I have to explain this illustration to people because it gives the impression that the Africans were treated the same as the whites. There were actually two Africans that were with Lawson and with de Graffenried when they were captured by the Tuscaroras and put on trial for kidnapping and selling into slavery Native American women and children. Both Africans were immediately freed, allowed to go free. One African joined the Tuscaroras and participated in the war. The other African hid in the forest and then returned to John White after he was tried and released. To de Graffenried. John Lawson was actually executed by the Tuscaroras for his crimes against the Tuscarora, but Baron de Graffenried was freed, because the chiefs spoke in his favor, and he was freed. the slave that was with the Graffin Rid, one of the slaves hid in the forest and then returned to the Graffin Rid when he was released. The Graffin Rid drew the illustration, and he drew his faithful slave there beside him because he was loyal to him and returned to him. But the other slave is not represented in the image because he did not return. He joined the Tuscaroras. And the Tuscaroras were known for taking in runaway slaves and adopting them into their nation. And those slaves oftentimes, of course, helped them design fortifications and fought with them when they fought against the whites during the war. Next slide, please. These are images of the attacks. Tuscaroras attacked plantations and settlements. And they freed Africans unless the Africans took up arms against them and supported their white slavers. So they, again, during the war, again, they made a distinction between the Africans who were enslaved, who they saw in the same condition as their loved ones who had been kidnapped and sold into slavery, but they did not appreciate the whites who had come and taken their people and sold them into slavery. Next slide, please. But it's also important to understand that during the Tuscarora War and the First War and Second, there were two wars. The Tuscaroras were united in the First War, and in that First War pretty much had defeated the whites in North Carolina. It was Native Americans, Cherokees, Creeks, Chickasaw.
Come on, y'all. Native Americans with a bow and arrows and tomahawk were defeating gun-wielding Europeans. All right. They don't really want to talk about the L's they were taking at the hands of the natives, huh?
Not Chickasaws, but Catawbas and Yamasees, who aligned themselves with the whites and created an overwhelming force that defeated the Tuscaroras at Fort Neoroka and basically ended up destroying the Tuscaroras, killing a third of them, enslaving a third of them, and then the rest became refugees and either fled North Carolina or dispersed into the swamps throughout eastern North Carolina. There are numerous descendants of the Tuscaroras in eastern North Carolina today, and Robeson County and in other various counties between Robeson County and Berkeley County, but numerous descendants of Tuscaroras and the other Indian groups, the Mattamuskeet and Machapungas, who fled into the swamps and remain, in North Carolina and refused to leave. Neoroka is, there was a memorial put there a couple of years ago. It is still considered one of the largest mass burials of Native people. Over 900, close to 900 people were killed and burned alive in the fort during the final siege at Fort Neoroka. It's still in Snow Hill, North Carolina today. And a memorial to those people who were killed in that battle was put up a couple of years ago, which I thought was a wonderful thing to talk about, what had happened in terms of the sacrifice that Tuscarora people had experienced during the Tuscarora War and the impact that it had on the Tuscarora people in North Carolina. Next slide, please. So, and again, you have to close me down because we're wrapping it up. The war ends. These are the nations here: the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Yamasees, the Catawbas, and then white slavers who basically destroyed the Tuscaroras in eastern North Carolina and enslaved them. And it leads to what we call the Tuscarora diaspora, because even though there were many Tuscaroras that stayed in North Carolina as refugees in their homeland, fleeing persecution, and
I'm sure you've heard all about the African diaspora, but have you heard about the Tuscarora diaspora? The indigenous folks of the land that you reside in and the best diaspora they had in the rich history? They want to teach us about an African diaspora, though.
Violence. Others left North Carolina and settled in a host of places. Next slide, please. It's important to understand that following the Tuscarora War and the acquiring of Tuscarora and their allies' land in eastern North Carolina, in a skirmish after the war in 1715, in which a white was wounded. He wasn't killed, he was wounded by Tuscaroras. The state of North Carolina issued a general order that called for the complete destruction of the Tuscarora nation as if there had never been a peace made with them. That order led to the systematic slaughter of the remaining Tuscaroras throughout eastern North Carolina. A lot of people in Eastern North Carolina, if you talk to them, they're of African American, Native American, or mixed European ancestry. They'll say that they're Cherokee. Now, Cherokees were never in this part of Eastern North Carolina other than during the Tuscarora War. Cherokees' lands begin in Tennessee, in the mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina. But the Cherokees were great heroes to North Carolina for their role in the destruction of the Tuscarora during the Tuscarora War. So I believe, and this is an assumption, that as a defensive mechanism or a way to preserve their existence, many remnant peoples who were Tuscarora or other began to say that they were Cherokee to basically preserve their existence in Eastern North Carolina. Because Tuscaroras, if they knew you were a Tuscarora, you would either be killed or you would be enslaved. Your women and children would be taken and enslaved. And so many of the Tuscaroras who were left in Eastern North Carolina after the war, who did not migrate out, just kind of went undercover and just blended into the white and the general Black population in Eastern North Carolina.
All right, I'm going to interrupt now.
Okay.
Although I think it was very, very.
That's interesting. I didn't know that, especially me being a native of the West Coast. And again, that's just his assumption. That's just his opinion. But he's saying after the Tuscarora War, they were killing off all the Tuscaroraans. So a lot of them started to claim to be Cherokee just so they could save the lives of their family and their children. Interesting. It's just like how during the Jewish Holocaust, Jewish people would change their last name, hide their ethnicity, not wear the Star of David. People do this.
Very interesting. We have some comments, but I also want to say anybody who wants these slides, please email me and I'll get them to you. Dr. Smallwood has given us that great privilege, and thank you for your willingness to share. So any teachers that want to share this with your students or expand on this conversation, or maybe even ask Dr. Smallwood to do a sub, because all of these things that we talked about today were really like a whole semester, today and the last time. And we did all that. You did a great job of maintaining, I feel a scholar for real. And I know that you travel throughout North Carolina doing presentations and virtually. I thank you for sharing your expertise with Wake Tech students, faculty, staff, and community. The first is Chris. American slave trade. I always wondered about that. This is great. We definitely like to learn about it. Thanks, Chris. And Zach Oxendine. I know some Oxendines. That's great information. They're from down in is it Robertson? Not Robertson County, but Chris, again, that's great. Chris, you just liked a lot, didn't you? I just watched a 5-part series on slavery with Dr. Henry Louis Gates on the front line, which started in the 1500s. He went through the timeline very quickly, but this is great. And Christy Shields, again, our student activities director, and you got to meet her backstage earlier. Great information. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Tanya Beatty, that's interesting about the Cherokee lady. I didn't think of that. Keem, again, do you know any ancestry research that can distinguish the ancestry? So this is a question for you.
And yes, if you reach out to me by email, I can give you some links. There's several, especially with DNA today, there's several projects that really go through people's connections to various Native groups. And I can give you the links to those, and they actually use DNA as well to try to match families.
I'm sorry, guys. It looks like YouTube's messing with the quality of the screen. Let me get some fists and feathers in the chat if you can at least hear me a-okay. I know the stream's coming through a little bit distorted. The man be trying to keep me down, y'all. Come on. Let's talk about it, y'all. Let's talk about it. Every time I do a stream related to Aboriginal history, I get some strange technical difficulties. Who is it? Is it the Africans? Is it the Europeans? Who is it, y'all? It's somebody. But hopefully it'll clear up. Let's see.
families and match people. So yes, there are old sources that talk about family names, because there are certain family names, as Michael just noted, the Oxidines, just like Locklears down in Robeson County. You got Locklears, Oxidines, Lowrys. There are a couple of families that are very, very prolific, very prominent, well-known families that are connected. So yes, there are lists of native families and native peoples, and then people have been using DNA to match those people as well. And even with some of the mixed race people, I think Tanya Beatty, I've talked to some folks, they're part Saponi, part Lumbee, and part Tuscarora. And then, they have these mixes, and you have clumps of family names with the Melungeons, and they overlap. Whether we're talking about Gibsons, or because you even see there's a reservation in Canada that's a Tuscarora, a Six Nation reservation. It's called Gibson. It has a native name as well, but it was called Gibson for a long time. And then we had Gibsons all over. You'll find Gibsons with the Melungeon name, as well as with some Indian families. But there are some families that overlap and some that don't. It's all a matter of where they settled and who they intermarried with, and you'll have consistency with certain family names.
Okay. Laura Bethay from our Office of Career and Employment Resources. Wow, this is a wealth of information. I'm intrigued to learn more. Thanks for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. And Laura also works on our equity and diversity projects at Wake Tech, which I think she does an excellent job with that, making sure that we have equitable outcomes for all of our students. Finally, I'm going to let you have the closing word, and I'm going to say this is the Michael Ure Show version of the Martin Luther King holiday celebration. And I know people like to do breakfasts and sing Kumbaya, but I think this kind of information is very relevant to what Martin Luther King stood for. And I hope that we will celebrate it virtually. And I will also say the North Carolina Museum of History will be hosting the statewide kickoff for Black History Month for North Carolina on January the 30th, the last Saturday. And you can go to the museum's website and get that information, and you can sign up for different workshops and jazz.
All right, guys. Well, that's all we got for this broadcast. Don't go anywhere. Right after this stream ends, it's going to segue you into the next live stream. I'll see you over there in just a moment.
The Flicks Tape.
They have no future, as they have no past. Tomorrow, as today, slavery will be their only possible privilege.
We gods, man. We kings, man. We lords. I was born black, I live black, and I'm gonna die probably because some cracker that knows I'm black better than you, nigga, is probably gonna put a bullet in the back of my head. This is the remix. My father was raised in the era when black niggas couldn't claim Native American.
Aborigines, which means what? Black folks. But you never find a white aborigine. Rather, aborigines are called natives, or they're always dark-skinned people. You and I are aborigines, but you don't like to be called an aborigine. You want to be called an American. Aborigine actually means from the beginning. Two Latin words, ab meaning from, origine meaning the beginning.
Great shock, around the age of 5 or 6 or 7, to discover the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. That the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity.
Remember that big Indian dude in that movie? Mm-hmm. He was cool. And then he couldn't talk unless he was talking about gum?
Yeah. I think you're not supposed to say Indian either.
Oh, wait, really?
Yeah. I think you're supposed to call them African Americans.
Oh, you're shoemakers now. And more importantly, you're a person of color. You're no longer a Nipmuc person. And that shows through in these county histories and also in the census records at the time. You find a person described in the 1860 census as an Indian. In the 1870 census, they're described as a person of color or a colored person. Same person, but the census taker, as part of the white dominant society, decides that this person is no longer Nipmuc.
Since y'all always screaming about DNA, watch what the biology professor says about DNA. Watch this.
Smith's breakdown from Ancestry showed 97% European and 2% Asian.
I'm a black girl. I am not a Jewish white lady. I'm black. My parents were black.
She contacted Ancestry with questions, but says a rep told her the results are accurate.
These DNA tests for ethnicity are entertainment value only.
William Gilliland is a biology professor at DePaul. He says DNA kits can be great for connecting family members and finding relatives, but the science for ethnicity testing isn't as concrete.
There's nothing that confident for ethnicity. There's no diagnostic nucleotide. You can say this person is from Europe, this person's from Africa.
You see that? DNA can't tell you where you're from. A scholar tells the truth. Watch this.
But many African Americans, you are the Native Americans. You're not even African Americans, you're Native Americans. You're the ones that they brought blankets with, was it smallpox or whatever diseases, and wiped out entire communities because they said they came in peace, but they actually came in war. And they are still warring us right until this day. So there are those beloveds of you who really don't feel any connection to Mama Africa. And this is just, you know, a confirmation, a reassurance that America belongs to you.
So Africans know this history, but nobody else does? Come on, make it make sense.
At me. And so with the help of my wife, we extracted enough saliva to send off in the mail. We were so excited to see the results. After about 3 months, we were shocked. My lizard was 51% Ashkenazi Jewish. He was also 48% West Asian. This was really interesting. They also gave us a little bit of his background and his history, what he liked to eat, etc. Let us know which animal's DNA we should send in next.
You don't have to try to be something you're not.
Trying to be something I'm not? Trying to be proud of my African heritage? That's being something I'm not, then fine.
My grandmother was a full-blooded Iroquois.
I know all of that, Mama.
They don't know this. I am alive because of the blood of a people who never scraped or begged or apologized for what they were. They asked only one thing of this world, to be allowed to be.
It broke my heart when you changed your name. I gave you my grandmother's name, a woman who bore 9 children and educated them all, who held off 6 white men with a shotgun when they tried to drag one of her sons off to jail for not knowing his place. And you had to reach into an African dictionary to find a name that would make you proud.
My father was raised in the era when black niggas couldn't claim Native American. Making music would've thought I had help, but the Indians I know wanna be the chief they self.